Good evening. I'm Harold Pachios. We're on the air once again with another edition of Pachios on the News. This one we're going to talk about immigration. And we have as our guest Professor Alan Wells, a retired professor of history at Bowdoin College, who's an expert on many things, including the history of immigration in the United States. I've wanted to do this show on immigration for a long time, and it is particularly important now because we've just finished with ICE arrests in Portland, and we've seen what happened in Minneapolis, and it has been on the front burner, the whole issue of immigration, on the front burner for a long time. In fact, for a couple of decades now, members of Congress have understood that we need to amend the current immigration law in the United States to reflect current situation and change in all kinds of things, including culture. But it's like the third rail of politics. This is not a partisan statement. I mean, you can look at you look at history. For some reason, the Republicans are afraid of it, and you will recall, I'm sure, that just last year or a year and a half ago, during the election year, there was a bipartisan group in the Senate who had put together a compromise bill to amend the immigration law and to bring it into modern times. And Donald Trump urged the Republicans all to vote against it because he said it's a good issue for us. So it's awfully hard to get the law changed these days. In this century, and we'll talk about this, it hasn't changed at all. In the last century, it changed 2 or 3 times. And it's a very difficult and emotional subject for people, and it brings out all of their biases and prejudices, and it's difficult. So history is important, and that's why we have a historian on the show tonight to talk about this. I told a friend of mine, Dan Warren, a now retired lawyer and former state legislator, about the show yesterday, and he said, "Oh, I'll watch that." He said, "I had a professor of journalism at University of Maine, Brooks Hamilton," and some of you who watch public TV remember Brooks Hamilton. He was a very well-known personality, particularly in the field of journalism. And he said Professor Hamilton used to say at the beginning of each semester about journalism and about what journalists would observe, there is nothing new under the sun. Everything's happened before. And so I thought that was an appropriate comment on this show and history and immigration. There is nothing new under the sun. And I'll add one other anecdote. Years ago, when I was a very young man, I worked for Sergeant Shriver back in the Kennedy administration. He was President Kennedy's brother-in-law, and he was the first leader and actually inventor of the Peace Corps. And one of the things I did occasionally was ride up to the Hill, because I was in congressional relations with Mr. Shriver. We didn't have limos in those days. We went in a taxi. And we would go up from, we were down by the White House, our office, and we would go up to the Hill to talk to members of Congress about the Peace Corps. And we would go up Pennsylvania Avenue past the Archives, National Archives building, and engraved in stone in the front of the National Archives building is the phrase, "What is past is prologue." And about the first time and the 10th time and the 20th time I went with Shriver, he repeated himself. "You know what that means, Harold? Buddy, you ain't seen nothing yet." So, welcome, Professor Wells.
Thank you. It's nice to be here, Harold.
We're delighted to
I've enjoyed your show for a long time, so it's good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As you know, you've watched the show. What I try to do, sometimes I talk too much. I'm not going to tonight, but self-criticism informs me that I talk too much. but we want you to talk, and we want you to talk about immigration, a very, very current issue in our country, but not for the first time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and it is a very important subject, as you mentioned, and it's certainly in the news of late, and it certainly had an impact on our community here. So, you know, there is an interesting tension in U.S. immigration policy going back to the founders. On the one hand, we all are, we know we are a country of immigrants. I looked it up, and there's something like 86 million immigrants who've come to the United States since the founding of the Republic in 1783. So many of us have immigrants in our family. I know you have immigrants from Greece. I have immigrants from Central Europe in my family. And I don't think we're alone in that. And we all learned when we were children about the Statue of Liberty and what Emma Lazarus' poem on the Statue of Liberty, "Give me your tired, give me your poor, give me your huddled masses, yearning to be free." And certainly that has resonated throughout American history. So we are a country of immigrants, but we are also a nation that has tried to restrict immigration of certain types of peoples coming in here. And we've also deported people. Obviously, deportations have gotten a lot of ink of late, but we have consistently deported immigrants, and I'll be happy to talk about that. So there has been a consistent pattern since the founding of the Republic. Borders have often been closed to those our government have thought of as dangerous, as criminal, or who we thought couldn't be assimilated into the United States. In fact, the nation's first immigration law, dating back to 1790, restricted citizenship to white people. You know, we've restricted all different kinds of people. Chinese were excluded in 1882. Anarchists were excluded in 1903. Other Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians, were excluded in 1917. So there has been a consistent pattern of restrictions to who should be allowed into this country. So whereas we are a country of immigrants, we've also restricted. So in fact, there have even been times when we've tried to restrict white people from coming into this country. The arrival of large numbers of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe before, during, and after World War I.
People like my father and your family.
Exactly, exactly.
We tried to keep
them out.
our relatives out too.
Exactly. Congress sought to limit the numbers of those coming, and in 1924, the National Origins Act, or the Johnson-Reed Act, as it was called, established a system of quotas. Go ahead.
Well, no, I just wanted to say, I think let's start there. That's a good starting point for us. The Johnson-Reed Act, 1924, we call, otherwise known as the National Origins Exclusion Act, to exclude certain people from what was then thought to be, in the 1920s, S-hole countries. We know we're back to that again, of saying this country is a S-hole country and we don't want any people from there, or this country is full of people of a religion, we don't want those people here. They're unclean, we don't want them, and we know that because our forebears came from what was then known as S-hole countries. So we got, I have a picture of, we've done the National Origins Act, and we're going to show a picture later on of the act that repealed the National Origins Act and repealed the quota system, country quota system. we'll get to that. But go ahead, talk about the 1920s.
Sure. So this system of quotas was established in 1924, whereby it was based on 2% of each nationality's proportion of the entire U.S. population in 1890. Why did they choose the 1890 census? I mean, this was 1924. Why not choose a census closer to 1924 like the 1920 census, right? You might ask.
Go
ahead.
Let me, and so you ask, and let me give my answer.
Okay.
So, my father came to this country in 1914 with his parents. He was 9 years old. They were villagers, poor farmers, uneducated, looking for a better life, and they had nothing. And they came from an S-hole country, and known in those days. And they were shorter and darker, and spoke a very strange language, and had a different religion. And so we didn't want people like my family here. And so they picked 1890 because most of the immigration from Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, and Eastern Europe, which is mostly Jewish, began in the late 1890s. Exactly. And so between 1898 or 1899 and 1924, when they were shut off, in my case, there were probably 500,000 Greeks that immigrated to this country. Maybe 300. I'm sorry, it's 300,000 Greeks that had immigrated to this country in those short number of years, 25 years. Before that, there might have been a dozen Greeks a year. And so that's why they selected that 1890, because they established a quota based on a time when no Italians, no Greeks, no Jews from Eastern Europe were coming to this country.
You nailed it.
So
you absolutely nailed it. Yep, that's exactly why they did it. And and there were certain, what I would call pseudo-scientific theories, which underwrote their thinking about this, Congress's thinking about this. So for example, the pseudo-scientific theory of eugenics was in vogue during the 1920s. Eugenics held that the proponents of eugenics held that the way to improve the national gene pool was to keep out inferior peoples. And as you said, Southern and Eastern Europeans, as well as Asians and Latin Americans, were considered to be inferior peoples. So that was the thinking of many congressmen during that time. The other thing I would say in the early 1920s, there was a huge distrust of foreigners, xenophobia during that time. And we have the second wave of the KKK during the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan. And the Klan was immensely popular in the 1920s. It's hard to imagine, but there were Klan chapters here in Maine.
Very active in Maine.
Very active in Maine.
Mostly against Catholics.
Mostly against French Catholics, right? Distrust of foreigners.
Right.
But also Jews. Obviously the Klan were white supremacists, so they were opposed to darker skinned peoples. So the Klan and eugenicists combined to push for the National Origins Act in the 1920s. And those quotas ensured that fewer people would come, as we said, from Southern and Eastern Europe from that point on. And so, whereas your parents came, was it during World War I or right around World War I?
No, just before, 1914.
1914. My parents came before and after World War II. And they found it very, very difficult to come in because the number of people from Central and Eastern Europe were limited by that reliance, as you said, on the 1890 census for exactly that reason.
While we're on the National Origins Act that
Yeah.
was enacted in 1924, if anybody's really interested in this, it is kind of fascinating, particularly if your parents or grandparents came from one of these areas that were excluded. And I have a lot of Italian friends, and they were put in that category. They didn't want them. They simply didn't want them in this country. And during the debate in 1924 on the National Origins Act, there were some prominent lobbying groups. And one of the most prominent in favor of the Exclusionary Act, the National Origin Act, was the Daughters of the American Revolution. Now, I think they've changed a lot now. They're good people, but they wanted to keep these people out. They wanted pure American stock, real Americans, the ones that came here in the 18th century. And those were the good people,
Yeah.
and the lighter-skinned people. And then on the other side, lobbying against this Exclusionary Act was what had suddenly become a very powerful organization, the Sons of Italy.
Oh, yeah.
So the Sons of Italy were in there trying to save their people,
Yeah.
and the Daughters of American Revolution were against them,
Yeah.
and therein was an example of who was battling.
We should mention that it wasn't like the United States was the only country doing this. That these kinds of exclusionary, restrictive laws were being embraced by countries not just in Europe, but around the world. Think about it. Before, during, and after World War I, that was, the Great War resulted in millions of destitute European refugees spilling across borders and migrating abroad. And they're going all over. They're going to Latin America, they're going to Asia, they're going to Africa. As a result, all the countries of the world are, in a sense, becoming more restrictive about who they were going to let in, not just the United States. So they set up rigid border controls. The US did that. They issued passports for the first time. And they put in restrictions on entry. That became the norm globally during the 1920s and 30s. It was revealing, Harold, that the Johnson-Reed Act, the National Origins Act that we're talking about, was lauded by none other than Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf, and the Nazis patterned their immigration laws on the United States Act at that time.
And motivated by the same things. Remember,
Exactly.
Purity of bloodlines, pure Americans, pure Aryan Germans.
Yeah.
There were great similarities, and it's a fact.
Yeah.
It's a fact of history. But a lot of people either don't want to pay attention to history, or in these days, apparently, the days of social media, they want to change the facts.
Yeah.
And I know that this is off subject, but as an example.
You mean you go on tangents?
Yes.
My students always said to me, we really like Professor Wells's tangents. And I didn't know whether that was a compliment or not,
Well, this is
anyway.
This is a tangent, changing the facts of history. So we're doing that in this country today. The Smithsonian, they want them to remove any exhibits relating to slavery, like slavery didn't exist, and let's talk about other things, but let's not talk about the things that happened in America that weren't so good.
Yeah.
And it's crazy. So we're trying to eliminate knowledge of history. it's crazy.
Music to my ears as a historian, right? We shouldn't be doing that.
Right.
I would say, though, Harold, that immigration policies were not immutable. They changed. And even restrictive immigration policies, there were exceptions to them. So let me give you a few examples of this just to show you how this worked. So after the Civil War, one of the things that happened was the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So in 1868, the United States passed a law, right, that permitted Chinese to come in to this country for the express purpose of working on building the Transcontinental Railroad. No sooner had they done that, when the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, that they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So in a period of 14 years, we've gone from welcoming Chinese immigrants for economic reasons in this country, and then excluding them when we no longer needed them, right? Another example. During World War II, we needed labor in this country, especially in agriculture, because so many soldiers were, out of the country, right? Fighting World War II. In fact, women began to enter the workforce. Rosie the Riveter, we know that story well. So the United States needed labor. So they passed an agreement called the Bracero Agreement, which was strong shoulders, right? Hard workers. And by that turn, tens of thousands of Mexican workers came into this country to work temporarily. And legally, absolutely legally, for short term to work in agriculture. And the Bracero Agreement, right, which came about in 1942, it was an agreement between the US government and the Mexican government where there would be legal immigration, right, which was an exception to the 1924 Act that we've been talking about, right? And that stayed in effect, more or less. It changed a little bit, but it was the same law, stayed in effect from 1942 until 1964, when the act that you just talked about, passed by the Johnson administration, was passed. 65. Yeah. So the Bracero Agreement allowed for this temporary workforce to come in to work in agriculture. Where would that be? In the southwestern part of the United States and the western part of the United States in agriculture. But in the 1950s, during the Eisenhower administration, there was a concern that the country was being overrun by Mexican immigrants. So what did Eisenhower do? He implemented something which came to be called Operation Wetback, that deported hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers, some of them legally here.
Under the Bracero program.
Under the Bracero program, but also others who, I mean, parts of Western United States was part of Mexico until 1848. Right. So those Mexicans had been here, probably their ancestors had been here when it was part of Mexico and part of the Spanish Empire. So now we have the situation where they're being welcomed on the one hand and then being restricted on the other hand. And US immigration policy is filled with these kinds of exceptions. Let me give you another example. The Kennedy administration, right, after the Bay of Pigs, right, decided to make exceptions to whom? To Cubans fleeing the Cuban Revolution during the 1960s. And that eventually led to what was called the wet foot, dry foot policy, whereby if a Cuban migrant was able to put their foot in Florida, they would be given an exception, right? And they would be given asylum, right, during that time. So the whole history of US immigration policy is forever immutable. It changed, it evolved over time. We can't see it as a static thing, right? Depending on the need for workers.
And that's not a bad thing oftentimes.
No, absolutely not.
To recognize what our needs are and so forth. Now, let me go back to something you talked about earlier. Deportations are not new. I know that under the under Democratic administrations, there have been plenty of deportations.
Absolutely.
A lot of deportations under Barack Obama's administration. In fact, I think more when Barack Obama was president than when Trump was in his first term. It was nowhere near as much deportation as there was under Obama. So, and I think most people understand, look, if a person is illegal, the law has to be enforced. But we seeing something different now. Now we've got a show going on, and it's not the worst of the worst as it's been sold. It's just the opposite. They tell us the worst of the worst, and then some guy who's an engineering graduate of the University of Maine and has a green card and working for an engineering company as a mechanical engineer in Portland, commutes from Freeport to work, pulls into his parking lot, and cars surround him with federal agents, and they break the window of his car and haul him out and take him away to prison. That's not anything to do with...
We haven't seen that before.
We haven't. We did see it once before in the period following World War I, when we had the who was the
Palmerston raids.
Palmer raids.
Palmer raids. Yeah.
Palmer was the Attorney General of the United States with great political aspirations. Democratic administration, Woodrow Wilson, great political. He knew that people didn't like foreigners. He knew that people didn't like radical talk. He knew all of this, and so he started going after them. And we talked about this once before. This made J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover was 24 years old.
Yeah, he got his start.
In the Palmer raid.
Deporting people, yes.
And they would deport the radicals and the Bolsheviks and
anarchists.
But there was no due process. There were no hearings.
No.
They would round them up, arrest them, and put them on a ship.
Yeah.
That was it. And so nothing's new under the sun.
Absolutely.
Because human beings are the same. They've always been resentful of strangers. We've never been, human beings have always feared strangers, and they still fear strangers. Foreigners, you hear people today say, well, they're foreigners.
Yeah.
Foreigners. Human nature.
As if it was an insult or
As
something.
if an insult.
Yeah.
And, you know, we have a little bit different perspective because we were born of these foreigners.
Yes, right.
And we think they're okay.
Yeah, right.
I think my dad was terrific.
Yeah.
But he was a foreigner.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right, Harold. You can go back to the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1797 in the Adams administration, which tried to keep out the French, right? Because the Federalists, the party that Adams was a part of, was opposed to the French, right? And so, yeah, I mean, there are many examples of that. You could even think about something that was passed in the Jackson administration, Andrew Jackson administration, the Indian Removal Act. I mean, we tend to think of restrictive policies on immigration, but we've also deported people from within the United States. And the Indian Removal Act, what did it do? It took Native Americans and deported them to the other side of the Mississippi River, what we call the Trail of Tears, right? Tens of thousands.
That's what that refers to,
Indians.
Trail of Tears.
Exactly, taking the Cherokee
Yeah.
and other Choctaw and other tribes in the southeastern part of the United States and making them move over 1,000 miles so that
Walking, right?
walking, exactly,
Yeah.
across the Mississippi River
Yeah.
and put them on reservations there. I mean, that's a form of restrictive immigration. You're
Yeah.
taking them out of the area where people were living. So this idea of deportations has a long history, You could see it after 9/11, when we became very concerned. The Patriot Act was passed, and we became very concerned about people of the Muslim faith, right? So there is a long history of that in our country. So we should not think of deportations as anything new in our history.
But there's a long history of it, and you've alluded to a couple of occasions when there was no due process, no individual rights, no civil rights at all. Palmer raids. Currently under Trump, we do take people off the street, break the windows, the car, seize them, leave their babies in the car and take them off to some prison, sometimes fly them out of the country.
Yeah.
Without a hearing.
Yeah, that's new. We've kind of encouraged other governments to accept these immigrants. Third-party governments.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily taking people from Mexico back to Mexico. We might be taking them to El Salvador or somewhere else, you know?
See, I don't object to enforcing the law.
Exactly.
If somebody is illegal, okay, you have to enforce the law. But there's a process, and now we're doing away with the process. Thankfully, many federal judges have
stepped up yeah.
and said, look, there are rules. But I guess there is nothing new under the sun. We've done it all before.
You know, it is interesting, though, if we think about it. When you pass restrictive immigration laws, when you militarize the border, the way the Trump administration has been doing, what happens? Let's think about this for a second. What are some of the unintended consequences of that kind of policy? Well, if people are desperate to leave their homeland, people don't leave their homelands lightly. There have to be push factors that cause someone to leave their country, right? Why would they leave their home? Why would they leave the culture that they grew up in, the language that they speak? Their relations are there, their family members are there. That's the last thing they want to do. So they do not take this decision lightly, right? But maybe there are economic factors going on which cause them to leave. Maybe there's a Great Depression going on, or an economic downturn. Maybe there are political reasons that cause them to flee their countries. Maybe they're being religiously persecuted. Whatever reason they have, they don't make this decision lightly. But if they have few options, what are they going to do? If they can't get into a country legally, they're going to try to get into a country illegally. And so what we've seen ever since 1924, since the National Origins Act, is people trying to get into our country illegally. And therefore, we now have so many people, by some estimates, 11 million people in this country, who are illegal aliens. What is it like to be an illegal alien in a country like this? Well, you have no rights to citizenship, right? You can't vote, right? You have no say in this country. You're marginalized in this country. You're, in a sense, concerned. You're scared because at any moment, as we've said, you could be deported, right? So on the one hand, we welcome these people here. We need their economic labor, right, at various times. But on the other hand, we ostracize them. And that has been a feature of this restrictive immigration policy that we've been talking about.
And, you know, that's what the so-called path to citizenship is all about.
Yeah.
If you've been in this country, if you're illegal, and you've been in this country a long time, and you have a family, and you have children, and your children are going to school and university in this country.
Yeah.
And, but you are in an illegal immigrant's family, and they want to deport you. There are people that say there ought to be a path to citizenship for good people who contribute a lot to this country. that we ought to find a path for them. And that can't get through Congress
Yeah.
because we have a lot of opposition. President Trump is very much opposed to a path to citizenship for these people who have been here decades and worked hard and have raised their families here.
And interestingly, he is in opposition to another Republican president, Ronald Reagan, who passed an immigration policy in 1986 that made exceptions and provided for alternatives to a path to citizenship
I
for
want
them.
to say to our audience, go online and look up, I think it was Reagan's last speech when he was president. I think it was kind of his farewell, where he talks about immigration. Reagan on immigration. And he had a very expansive view, and one with empathy, and
Yeah.
you know, he was great on the subject. So going back to what you said, the reason that they leave. I know you know a lot about Latin America, and about, you know, we know how they come through swamps. They're threatened. They die on the way. They drown. They're bitten by snakes. They come through hell, walking from somewhere in South America to the border of the United States. Terrible thing. And I'm reminded of a movie, and again, I'm going to recommend to our audience that maybe they ought to watch this movie. Go online. America, America. It's about immigration. It was produced probably 30, 40, 50 years ago by Elia Kazan.
Wow.
Elia, E-L-I-A, Kazan, K-A-Z-A-N.
On the waterfront.
He did On the Waterfront,
Yeah.
too. And Elia Kazan did this movie, America, America, which was about his family. And he was a Greek from Turkey, and his uncle was the first to come. And the movie is about what his uncle went through, what he went through as a kid to come by himself to the United States. And took him a year, and all kinds of terrible things happened to him. But he persevered because it was so important to come. And I remember watching a TV interview of Elia Kazan, and the interviewer said to him, "Did you ever ask your uncle why he went through all of this terrible ordeal to come to the United States?" And Kazan said, "Yes, I did." Well, what was the reason? He said he was saving himself. And that's what these people, asylum seekers, most of them, there's some bad people. There were probably bad people in the Daughters of American Revolution. So, but mostly they're saving themselves, and they go through hell often to get here.
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about my family's story. It's very unusual in some respects. In other ways, it's very comparable to what so many immigrant families have gone through. So my dad was born in Vienna in 1918, and he was Jewish. And things got bad for Jews when, as the Nazis came to take power, and when the Nazis annexed Austria, he was born in Vienna, it was time for him to leave. So what did he do? He crossed the border into Switzerland illegally, right? He was picked up by the Swiss immigration police, and he was put in labor camps. And he worked for a year and a half in Swiss labor camps. And then relief organizations came to the camps and said, we're creating a new farming settlement in the Dominican Republic. And my dad looked at him and he said, where's the Dominican Republic? But he had few options, and he knew he couldn't stay in Switzerland indefinitely. And there was always the danger he could be deported back to Austria, which could be a death sentence for him. It was for many members of his family. So he goes to the Dominican Republic in 1940, totally different culture in the tropics, and he learns to become a farmer. And he, you know, typical immigrant story. He stayed there for 7 years, almost married a Dominican woman, he would tell us. After the war was over, Truman relaxed some of the visa restrictions because of what had happened as a result of the final solution in Europe. And he was able to come to this country. But he was here only on a 6-month transit visa because he had no one to vouch for him in this country. And the only place he could go back to was Austria because he was still technically an Austrian national. So what's his choice? He could either go back to Austria, a place that only had terrible memories for him, where he had lost so many members of his family, or he could stay in this country illegally after that 6 months. So he had been an undocumented worker in Switzerland, and now he's an undocumented worker in the United States. And he married my mother, who was a refugee from Czechoslovakia, and he was able to eventually get green card status and become naturalized over a period of time. So, you know,
Jesus, you're just one step away. They might get you.
Exactly. So the point is that, as my father said in his broken English, was, I made my way.
I made my way.
And I think that is a very typical immigrant story in this country.
Saving themselves.
Saving themselves, saving their family members, doing what's right for them, figuring out a way, you know. And that is so typical of immigrants who try to make their way. And that's why I'm saying these laws, you know, let's face it, whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, nobody wants open borders.
Nobody.
Nobody wants.
In fact, I will say this to my audience. I think Joe Biden was a disaster on the border, a total disaster.
It cost him big time.
It cost him and it cost the country, and we now have a reaction from the right because of Biden's failures. Sorry, write me letters and complain about what I said. So let's go back to the 65 Act. I'd like to talk about that because I was working in the White House when the 65 Act was.
Well, you should tell us about that one.
Well, since the National Origins Act passed in 1924, civil rights, people who were interested in civil rights were, wanted to reform the system and do something about this horrible 1924 National Origins Law that excluded your people, my people, and excluded all my Italian friends' parents and grandparents. And so it was a civil rights issue. Yeah. Because it was based on nothing more than where you were born, who you are, the color of your skin. And that was it. And eugenics and pure blood, pure American stock. That was what drove it. And so Johnson wanted to do something about it, and there was a member of Congress who had been there since 24, Emanuel Seller, a congressman from Brooklyn, New York. And he very much had spent all these decades wanting to get rid of the National Origins Act. So it got passed. We have a photograph, I don't know whether they can show it or not, of Johnson signing the act which repealed the national origins basis for immigration, the 1965 Act. He signed it at the Statue of Liberty. I was there, I went with him. Wow. I was working in the White House.
You're part of history, Harold.
Well, I am part of history, and I have hanging in my house a photograph of President Johnson at the Statue of Liberty, on Liberty Island, with Manhattan, Lower Manhattan in the background, speaking and signing the act. It was one of the highlights of my life because my father, all of my relatives on both sides had come through Ellis Island, which was the next island over. All of them had come to this country the first time into New York Harbor with the Statue of Liberty there. So it was a moving experience for me, and Johnson signed the picture because he knew it was a moving experience for me. That act is now outmoded. And, you know, it ought to be, we got to restrict it. We can't let everybody into this country.
Exactly.
And we ought to let people in who are going to be good for us, help us.
Exactly.
Most of the high-tech companies and high-tech inventions have been the product of immigrants, people who are great scientists who are immigrants, great physicians and medical researchers who are immigrants. Think what the Chinese, we excluded the Chinese from this country all those years. Look at what they have produced in this age of science.
Yeah.
In this country.
Absolutely.
So if we want to shut off immigrants, you're going to shut off America. We have to have immigrants, but we don't have to have everybody.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, you want to be smart about it, right?
You want to be smart about
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
Yeah.
So the Hart-Celler Act, the
Yeah.
one you're talking
Yeah.
about, that was passed by the Johnson administration, as you said, they abolished the quotas, but what did they replace it with? So they replaced it with a system where immigrants were admitted based on their relationship to a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident family member or a U.S. employer. So caps were placed on the total number of immigrants who may be admitted each year, right, which is comparable, but different reasons. Exceptions were made for immediate relations. And that immigration policy lasted about 20 years until the Reagan administration. And then Reagan passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA, which provided for a 50% increase in Border Patrol staffing. So here was an effort to, on the one hand, make exceptions to the policy, as I talked about, but also to fund a border patrol along the border to keep illegal immigrants out. And so they created two legalization programs, one allowing unauthorized aliens who had lived in the U.S. since 1982 to regularize their status.
So that's a pathway to citizenship?
Exactly, under the Reagan administration.
So Reagan created a pathway to citizenship.
He created two. That was one. The other permitted people who have worked for at least 90 days in certain agricultural jobs to apply for permanent resident status. So if you were brought in, for example, under a temporary program to work in the fields in California to harvest fruits and vegetables, and you were here for 90 days, you could apply for permanent resident status. As a result, roughly 2.7 million people who were then illegally residing in the United States eventually became lawful permanent residents. This was done under a Republican administration.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
A pathway to citizenship created by the Reagan administration. Let me ask you a question, but we get into economics, because there are economic reasons to encourage immigration.
Yeah.
We want immigrants if it'll help our economy. And so sometimes politics and economics get mixed together. Now, we want to get rid of, the current administration doesn't like immigrants, says bad things about immigrants, and get rid of illegals, all of them. Deport them all. Mass, that's important. They talk about mass deportations.
Right.
Because the people who don't like immigrants like the word mass. You're going to get them all.
Yeah.
Get rid of them.
Right.
So, but interestingly enough, there have been no ICE raids in two states with a lot of South American illegals, Florida and Texas. No raids. Maine, but not Florida and Texas.
Minnesota.
Minnesota, but not Florida and Texas.
Chicago.
Chicago, but not Florida and Texas. Any reason for that? You
Yeah,
think?
I think it's a political reason for that.
Yeah. So,
But it is interesting. I mean, you could imagine during economic downturns, right? We would be concerned about the country being overrun by illegal immigrants. So, for example, during the Great Depression, Americans a lot of them were out of work, right? As late as 1938, 9 years after the Great Depression began, 10 million Americans were out of work. So this was a long-standing problem. Some historians have argued that if it wasn't for World War II, the United States would not have gotten out of the Depression, that the Depression would have continued. But in any case, during World War II, there was a legitimate concern that Americans were not going to be able to keep their jobs or get jobs because of the straitened economic conditions. So public opinion was firmly against changing the quotas.
right.
There were efforts when there was so much discrimination and persecution happening in Europe during that time, but Americans were firmly against it. So even someone as liberal as FDR during World War II was very restrictive on immigration policy. And during the Great Depression, during the Roosevelt administration, 400,000 Mexicans who were in this country were deported by the Roosevelt administration. Half of those, roughly 200,000 of those 400,000, were legally in this country.
Why were they deported?
Because there was this
Too
fear.
many, not enough jobs to go around?
Not enough jobs to go around. So economic downturns can contribute to restrictive policies that deport even legal Americans.
I can understand that, and how, you know, if the people that have been here a long time can't find a job, they don't want more people coming and take the job.
Absolutely.
Also, it has worked over the years that the immigrants work for less, work harder, dirtier work.
Willing to do jobs that other Americans did not want to do.
And do it for less.
Yeah.
And I know that Greeks and relatives of mine, you know, they got recruited by labor agents to come and work in the textile factories in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, in the coal mines of West Virginia, and work in the mines in the Rocky Mountains. Coal mines, metal mines, and if you go to the Rocky Mountains, there are all kinds of people with Greek names out there. People got recruited, but they were persecuted, shot, killed because they worked for less, and
if they tried to unionize, they were crushed. And
the Colorado National Guard killed hundreds of Greek miners who tried to unionize and go on strike in Colorado.
Absolutely.
And they massacred them.
Yeah.
So it's
a tough history.
It's a tough history, and we know everybody. Look, I was chairman of the Commission on Public Diplomacy. I went all over the world visiting embassies for 12 years, three terms, even appointed to one term by Bush, George W. Bush. And it was clear in those days, I think it might have changed now, but everybody in the world admired this country. Everybody in the world wanted to come to a free country with a great economy.
The streets are paved with gold.
Streets are paved with gold. And you can't let them all in.
Yep.
And in those days, when my people came in 1914, from 1898, when the Greek immigration really began in earnest, to 1924, when it was Greek and Italian immigration and Eastern Europe immigration was shut off, they needed, the test was you get to the dock in Greece and they check to see your throat, they'd have to say ah, and they'd see if you had a sore throat or whether you had diphtheria or tuberculosis. And if you didn't, the doctors say, okay, you get on the boat. You get to Ellis Island, same thing. There was the immigrants who used to say, don't cough when you get to Ellis Island. They'll deport you. They'll send you back. And so that was it. There had to be, so many came, that there had to be some rules. And so the rules began in 1912. As you say, in the 1930s, they enforced those rules.
Yeah.
But, so what, and we got a couple minutes left. Latin Americans, they come all this distance. Is this, why we, is it because we're so close in the same hemisphere, or why we so many?
Well, I think most people who work on immigration talk about push and pull factors. Some factors are pushing you away from your homeland. Other factors are gravitating you towards a new country. So if you imagine that there are things in the United States, as you mentioned, that immigrants might want to take advantage of, better economic conditions, right? But there are other factors that are pushing them away from their homeland, right? Maybe poor economic conditions in their country, maybe political persecution, maybe war. So for example, during the 1980s, Central America was rife with conflict during the Cold War, and tens of thousands of Central Americans were fleeing warfare. So you have to look at conditions in the sending countries and also conditions in the receiving countries.
I think that's important. Well, look, I wish we could go another hour. It goes pretty fast.
Yeah.
And really appreciate you coming here.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Harold. Thanks for inviting me.
And